Good morning and welcome to the third Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee meeting of 2020. Item 1 on the agenda is a decision on taking items 4 and 5 in private. Is the committee agreed on that? Okay. Thank you. We now turn to item 2 in the agenda, which is our energy inquiry, and we have 4 witnesses with us today to give evidence, starting from my left to right. First of all, Neil Swanson, who is the Director of the Electric Vehicle Association Scotland. Scott Matheson, Network Planning and Regulation Director for SP Energy Networks Scottish Power. Stephen Veer, who is the Programme Director of Low Carbon at Scottish Futures Trust. And Ross Kirkland, who is the Senior Programme Manager at Technical Projects at the Energy Saving Trust. So welcome to all 4 of you this morning. Thank you for coming in. Before I come to questions from other committee members, I'd like to ask a few questions about distribution networks and whose responsibility is it to ensure that distribution networks are fit for purpose? What upgradings do we need and who will do it? And may I just say that there's no need to press any buttons. The sound desk will operate your microphones as discussion develops. If you're wanting to come in, just indicate by raising your hand and I will try and bring you in during my own or other members' questions. So I don't know who would like to comment first on that. Scott Matheson.
Thank you. So I guess it's, as the network's representative, it's incumbent on me to say from the outset. So we believe it's our responsibility to prepare the network for the future that we see ahead of us, not just for transport, but also for the changes in the heat system that are coming along as well. We also are very proud to be working with the Scottish Government in particular. There's a key document which exists in Scotland that doesn't exist throughout the GB called the Networks Vision document, which set out the need for much more integrated planning across the transport, heat and network vectors to realise our zero carbon targets as well. However, we cannot do it alone. Ultimately, we are regulated. We're a regulated monopoly, appropriately so. The businesses that we operate within are a natural monopoly and the consumer must be protected at all times. But it's very, very important that our regulator comes, Ofgem, the Office of Gas and Electricity Markets, come on this journey with us in terms of achieving policymakers' goals for the electrification of transport as well. And we believe that the framework at the moment needs to be able to incorporate the need and recognise the need for anticipatory investment. If we look at the scale of the change that we see on our networks ahead, we could see by 2032, in line with the Scottish Government's target, as many as 1 million electric vehicles on the roads of Scotland. Now, to put that into perspective, that was using smart charging and they all simultaneously switched on to charge at the same time when the market was at its cheapest price. That would more than double Scotland's winter peak demand on the electricity system. So we think there are huge savings by operating a smarter network, by changing people's behaviour in terms of how they utilise vehicles and when they charge. But there is a fundamental need for investment within the distribution system in particular to support the electrification of transport as we see that forward. And we are pushing very hard with our regulator at both the up and coming price control ED2, which begins to take effect in 2023, which we think is too late. We're pushing very hard with the regulator on the need to recognise changes now within the regulatory framework.
And if everyone suddenly had an electric vehicle overnight and charge them overnight, could the grid cope with that in Scotland?
So that's clearly a theoretical proposition. So we would act. Again, what we don't want to be is a barrier to people realising their ambition to own an electric vehicle. So we would begin to look at behavioural change, the time that people used the electricity system so that we could move that demand and round in time. We very often hear the proposition that price signals will be very important in that. We have to remember that the use of the electricity distribution system costs the consumer 35 pence a day. It's very, very difficult to send significant or material price changes that would change people's behaviour. if you're applying for a connection for a charger and you want 2 chargers at the moment, the connection charging approach would mean that the consumer would recognise that difference in cost of connection at the moment as well. So there's some things need to change. There's no doubt in charging, but it's not going to cause a big behavioural change. So I think in answer, if everybody from tomorrow had an electric vehicle and they were switching that on, the grid, the distribution system in particular, would definitely struggle. But there is benefits also for the grid. My colleague on the right, as well as representing the body, is a transmission engineer too. In Scotland, we have an abundance of generation. And one of the big issues that we have in transmission is congestion. Actually, higher demand from electric vehicles will actually reduce the constraints on the transmission system. So it's not a straightforward answer. There's no doubt that the distribution system would see challenges, particularly in the low voltage system, but also there would be benefits realised across the integrated transmission and distribution system from increased demand going forward too.
Thank you. I think Stephen Veer wanted to come in.
Hi, thank you, Convener. You asked the question, whose responsibility is it? And Scott gave the broad answer. It's government, UK, Scotland, it's Ofgem, it's industry, it's all our responsibility. But I would point the committee to the Infrastructure for Commission Scotland report that came out last week, and it highlighted that we cannot look at electric vehicles in the grid in isolation. We need to also look at heat. Along with their recommendation was that we must consider heat along with surface transport generally when looking at the grid, because electric vehicles is just a small part of the load. For example, the Royal Society of Edinburgh report suggested that electric vehicle uptake could increase peaks on the grid by 50%, whereas there's other reports, such as one from KPMG around heat, that suggested the electrification of heat, if all domestic and commercial heat was electrified, the peak on the grid would increase by 145%. So heat is a very big issue, well, in many ways bigger than electric vehicles, and we must look at both of them together. Thank you.
Right, thank you. I want to come to a question now from Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. Can I ask you just a daft laddie question? Why can't electrical vehicles be self-charging?
That's back to high school physics. Energy has to come from somewhere.
Wheels turning?
Yes, what makes them turn? The source of motive power has to be something. If you're coasting down a hill, you'll get kinetic energy recovery, but you had to put the energy in to get up the hill. So that original source of power comes from somewhere. You do not have free energy.
So the answer is no.
No.
Back to the drawing board. Okay, can I maybe ask a question which maybe is as much for Scottish Power as anybody else, because I'm quoting from your evidence that to successfully deliver Scotland's net zero target will require more collaborative and creative approaches from Ofgem, industry and government alike. Now, what would these more collaborative and creative approaches look like?
So integrated planning, and that has to involve both central government and local authorities as well. Yeah, I'm encouraged. I was just going to mention an example of that. So we are working with Transport Scotland on a project with 2 local authorities, which I can't mention at the moment, to look at ensuring that we can provide public charging infrastructure within those local authorities area. It'll add to about 25% increase to the existing number of chargers registered on ChargePoint Scotland. So it's not immaterial. They're 2 big local authorities. The advantage of doing that is that not only can we identify what type of transport, so we're basically looking at transport planning alongside grid planning. We're looking at the types of vehicles on the road, the journeys that they'll operate, everything from domestic to commercial. And we're looking at making sure that there's clear public access, also for consumers that live in multi-occupancy dwellings who will struggle with off-street parking. The advantage of working with the transport planners together with the local authority is we can also align that to where the grid has capacity and make sure that we can minimise the reinforcement costs on the grid from delivering that planning. So there's clear evidence, and I would, again, to emphasise, I touched on it as well, Stephen raised a really good point, is this also has to pick up the heat vector, as we don't want to begin into the streets laying cables repeated multiples of times. We've got to think about heat and transport together. So there are good examples. Again, I mentioned, I think it's a very important document. It's unique in the UK. I wish I could get the same from BEIS, but the Network's vision document, which begins to recognise Network's role in supporting transport and heat ambition, is very, very important. Last week I attended a session, a Network's leadership group, including consumer representatives, the National Grid, the transmission system, and both the Scottish distribution businesses, Scottish and Southern as well. And I think bringing people together in that discussion is vitally important, as well as actual physical integrated system planning across transport and networks.
And you're happy that's heading in the right direction at the moment?
I think it's a small step. I would like to see the pace pick up. If you look at the economic projections for electric transport, it will become more economic to purchase electric vehicles within the next two to 4 years. We believe that in order to realise the ambition and the rate of change, that the pace needs to pick up significantly. I think the one party that is coming a wee bit late to the table is Ofgem in terms of its role in facilitating this change as well.
Why is that?
I think there is such uncertainty in this area, and again, maybe Stephen touched on this. This is an area that policymakers can help provide better clarity. So there is no, at the moment, statutory instrument being put in place with the regulator. If I look at the growth in renewables in Scotland, and Scotland is a leading powerhouse in terms of the development. We have decarbonised our energy system ahead of heat and transport in a way that hasn't been seen globally anywhere else. We're leading in that area, and I think it's a real achievement. But one of the reasons we were able to do that was that there was a statutory direction to the regulator about its role and responsibility in delivering that future energy system from the power supply side, the generation side. I think we need the same on the demand side on transport and heat.
Perhaps logically leading on from what you say, what would a regulatory framework that's fit for purpose look like?
So first and foremost, they would allow, they've always got to protect the consumer in the uncertainty. And the debate often comes up about stranded assets. In the UK, and particularly in Scotland, I'm yet to see stranded assets. I see heavily congested assets despite the rate of investment in infrastructure that we have delivered. When I started in our business on the transmission side, we had 850 megawatts of transfer capability, export capability in Scotland on our transmission system. We now sit at 6,600 megawatts of transfer capability, and we still have congestion on the system. So I think the regulator's got to move beyond the stranded assets, and better planning should provide better certainty that they can hopefully work with us on in order to protect the consumer. An anticipatory investment mechanism is required. Those have existed and do exist at transmission, but they haven't been extended into the area of electrification of transport. There is a meeting.
From what you're saying, sorry to interrupt, but from what you're saying there, you seem to be expecting Ofgem to take the lead from a regulatory point of view there in driving this, and I'm not sure that's evident.
I'm expecting them to be a partner, so we don't think that they uniquely have the solution. And generally, for example, in renewables, industry has worked with the regulator on what the solution and the framework should look like, and there are good examples of that, particularly from the renewables world, that have allowed the facilitation of renewable generation through anticipatory investment mechanisms. There was one in the distribution system called the Distribution Generation Incentive Mechanism, which allowed effectively the businesses to build ahead of need for the supply and production of energy on the distribution system, but nothing exists at the moment in the area of transport or heat on the demand side. Nothing similar.
Sorry, I'd like to bring in Stephen Veer, and Richard Lyle wanted to come in with a brief question, I think, as well. Stephen.
There was a few questions there, and on the collaboration point, I just want to say that when you're planning any infrastructure, it's important that you understand the likely cost and the cost drivers of that infrastructure when you're at the planning stage. So if you're looking to roll out electric vehicle charging points, it's important that you understand the cost of connections to the grid, and understand if you've got options for putting charging in different places, how much is it going to cost to help you inform your decision of where you put them. One of the challenges right now is that there is a requirement on the DNOs to understandably treat everyone equally. But what it means is that at the stage of planning, if it's a local authority, for example, they might find it very difficult or a slower process to get the key information on the costs and drivers. Whereas what you actually want is, as Scott mentioned, on this strategic partnership, to be working with the DNOs in a collaborative, iterative process, so that you can understand the costs and make informed decisions based upon those costs. That was one point. The other point was around the Ofgem. You asked whose responsibility is it? I think it's responsibility of Ofgem, but also all government, UK government, devolved government, to work together collaboratively on this, because it cannot be solved by one organisation alone.
Richard Lyle.
Yeah. Scott Matheson, charging points and parking. For years in the Rural Affairs Committee, I've advocated that new homes, either private or being built by council, should have charging points installed in them now. Tenemental property, Glasgow, Edinburgh, wherever, physically you're going to have people hanging their charging leads out their windows to charge their cars. So how are we going to solve that?
So we have to tackle it. Multi-occupancy dwellings is one of the biggest challenges, and we need public charging infrastructure. Again, that's why we've chosen the two local authorities that we have, is that we recognise that that is one of the major challenges that Grid will face. So we believe we initially set out with a target of looking at somewhere of the order of about 90 sites being required within those two geographic locations. We've actually, through grid planning and transport planning, been able to cut that down to about 45 to 50. And that's a range of everything from 22 kilowatt chargers to 50 kilowatt chargers, so that we can also match that against grid capacity, or where that grid capacity can be delivered efficiently and quickly.
Just quickly, and I know it's up against time, but you go along any street in Glasgow, Duke Street, go along any street in Edinburgh, and you see cars parked nose to tail. So there may be 40 cars on an average street. So we're going to need 40 chargers, do we not? Or what?
We don't necessarily need 40 chargers. We need to look at the capacity and capability of those chargers. We also need to look at behavioural change. One of the key things that we need to look at is how we ensure that people do not hog the chargers, that they are being recycled and reused by people on those streets. One of the big challenges for urban environments in particular is also reducing the level of congestion that sits in our streets. So as important for me as everybody has universal access, it's not just those who own a private car, but those who rely on our transport system. And let's not ignore that either. It's not just about the cars parked in the streets. 2 weeks ago, we delivered the first electric bus in the Glasgow area into the Caledonian depot. There are 365 buses using the Caledonian right in the heart of the Gorbals. The first bus route that we delivered goes through Possil and Springburn, some of the most deprived and poor areas of the city, so public transport being an important artery for them within their local economies. 365 buses, requiring anywhere between 100 and 280 kilowatt chargers, which creates 8 to 16 megawatts of demand on a network that has 2 megawatts of demand. Now, we can deliver the capacity for that bus depot to operate, but not without an anticipatory investment mechanism in place. And again, I draw your evidence, and I think Stephen just referred to this, is the Infrastructure Commission for Scotland Key Findings Report, the Blueprint for Scotland, highlighted by 2021 Scottish and UK governments to develop an appropriately devolved regulatory framework. So one that doesn't just go at the average pace of the UK, but really recognises Scotland's ambition. And this is an important point. We're running ahead of other parts of the UK. And by 2022, Scottish Government, local authorities, regulators and industry to work together to establish incentivisation mechanisms and a route map for the transition to net zero. These are important. That concept of integration in terms of our planning is vital, as well as the need for pace within the regulatory frameworks. The Electric Vehicle Energy Task Force highlighted urgent need on government and Ofgem to facilitate effective planning and coordination of the rollout of EVs and electric network infrastructure at national and local level. Now, the type of work that we are doing with the two local authorities I mentioned is unique in the UK. There is no other network operator that's actually doing it. We're doing it in conjunction with our colleagues up at Scottish and Southern as well for the UK, and we're not only just dealing with the urban issues, but also the e-tourism issues. When you look at Portree and its summer population, it could treble or quadruple, and people will also need access to charging infrastructure in those environments, rural environments as well, which is vital for our economy as a whole.
Ross Kirkland wanted to come in, and then Stephen Veer again.
Thank you. Just a couple of things. I totally agree with Scott and Stephen that both heat and transport need to be considered together, and I would just add to that from my experience, communications networks go hand in hand with that, so that they can coordinate and communicate together. And also on the theme of collaboration, Energy Saving Trust are actually working with 11 local authorities throughout Scotland, from Dumfries and Galloway in the south to Orkney and Shetland in the north, on these very similar issues about how much public infrastructure is required that will meet different groups, such as those that don't have access to off-street parking of their own. And we understand that obviously the DNO costs for upgrades or potential upgrades are a vital aspect that we need to consider. And you know, we're open to engage with the DNOs and are trying to do so just now. So I think we all agree that it has to be a collaborative approach.
Stephen Veer.
Thank you, Convener. Scott made the good point about buses, and I thought it was just appropriate to say when we're considering public charging infrastructure, we should also consider what I would call the transport hierarchy. So it's not, I know this committee is about local energy and electric vehicles today, but we should also consider more sustainable travel, such as walking, cycling, public transport, and consider electric vehicles within that wider context.
Thank you. And Neil Swanson.
Yeah, I'd just like to reinforce that. We support the same hierarchy in transport. And one of the things we think about when we're looking forward at where we're going to charge these vehicles, obviously in the next 10 to 20 years, we will see the growth of autonomous vehicles, which will potentially reduce the need for ownership in those tenement apartments, which will impact on what we actually think about installing and how we manage charging of that type of vehicle. It's again going to be a game changer, and we need to go back to the anticipatory investment, think about how we manage that. If people have fewer cars but they're driving themselves around, how and where do we charge those? And the same will apply to buses.
Thank you. And Colin Beattie, any further questions? And then on to Andy Whiteman.
Just one perhaps final question. Have Ofgem and the UK government indicated they want the forthcoming price control framework to deliver the transition to net zero?
So certainly Ofgem in the recent consultation documents have recognised that. We had to write to them to ensure that the 2045 target, which is legislatively important within Scotland, needs to be recognised, as well as the 2050 target across GB as a whole. And we serve Merseyside and North Wales as well as Scotland, and again the Metro Mayor in Merseyside in particular has a different set of targets for that city as well. I think that the problem is that will leave decisions to 2023 that actually need to be taken at the moment. So what we are trying to also recognise is that in the interim, during the current price control, rather than waiting for the next price control that takes effect in the 1st of April 2023, Ofgem also need to respond. Now, there is due to be out, I believe, in the next month or two, a statement from Ofgem. I think perhaps the CEOs of the DNOs are being briefed today. I'll return to the office and find out what's been said. But Ofgem are making some statements about their commitment towards net zero. So I guess my answer is they have certainly recognised it. We have, in the last quarter of last year, seen a big change, but I expect more of them.
Right, Andy Whiteman.
Very much, Convener. Thanks for coming along today. I want to talk about the charging network, and so I presume the answer to the question as to who is responsible for the charging network is very similar to the question as to who's in charge of grid upgrades. It's sort of everybody, so I'll take that as read unless anyone has a different view. But we've seen quite a variable rollout of the charging network. So we've got cities, councils like Dundee, which are praised for their infrastructure. And we've got cities like Edinburgh that are very poor. I mean, how do we ensure that the network is developed in a way that is consistent and reliable right across the country?
I think one of the things there is we need to have some sort of coherent guidance for the local authorities. We're providing them funding, or you're providing them funding through Transport Scotland, but there isn't enough direction how they go in and assess it. They're left very much to their own devices. Dundee had their particular model to deal with air quality in the volcanic bowl, and that particular to Dundee. East Lothian has taken a different approach where they're looking at supporting individual communities to drive it forward. They're also engaging with companies to do a geospatial assessment of who can charge at home, who can't, and using that to drive how they model their infrastructure rollout. But there is no set framework for them to work within that. They're very much on their own. We can offer them advice as drivers with what we see when we're using the network, but it's difficult for us to offer them a clear evidence base without some framework to drive that.
So are you saying that Transport Scotland is providing this funding to local authorities, but without any guidance at all as to how it should be used?
Ross, you're probably better placed to answer that.
Yeah, so one of the programmes I work on is the Switched On Towns and Cities feasibility study work, and that is designed to provide local authorities with expert resource to look at those very issues. It's not really a good approach, perhaps, to broad brush everything, and there will be regional variations that need to be taken into consideration, but there are certain skills and methods that we can help local authorities with so that there's largely a similar approach. We're in our second year of studies just now, and potential for a third round next year. So by then we should have provided the local authorities with the tools to then go on and develop their own processes going forward.
I thought, first of all, Scotland should, it's worth putting it in perspective, and Scotland should give itself some credit. I just want to quote Department for Transport recently, November 2019, released a table of charging points per 100,000 of the population, and Scotland came second, with London coming first. Scotland had 32 charging points per 100,000, London had 49, and then at the bottom table was Yorkshire and Humber, who had 12. Now, we cannot be complacent. There is a lot needing done. Largely right now, the public infrastructure, the public charging infrastructure delivered by local authorities. Local authorities, like all government, central government, local government, have budgetary challenges and limited resources. So there's definitely a need for this to be prioritised, but there's also a need to get, as Ross said, the expertise and the resource in there so that we can future-proof, if you like, the network for the growth in electric vehicles.
And Neil Swanson, perhaps briefly, and then I want to bring another couple of committee members in on this specific point.
Just to add to Stephen's point, I think it is important we recognise the good work that Transport Scotland have done, and particularly ChargePoint Scotland. It is leading across the UK when you look at the statistics. And again, we serve Merseyside and North Wales and can see a distinct difference between the territory that we serve south of the border in terms of charging infrastructure. I've mentioned the project PACE, public access charging for EVs, that we're working with the local authorities. That again, I recognise what
Partnership.
That's the strategic partnership.
So it's called
PACE. public access charging for EVs. So it is, again, designed to improve the distribution across the network of a network that is accessible by all, including multi-occupancy dwelling and small commercial and industrial players as well. Again, that brings together the local authority. We're providing resources that local authority are trying to complement the resources that they have for planning. And I think both our colleagues have identified an important point. A lot of this sits with the local authority. So if you have 22 local authorities trying to do this, how do we coordinate that in a sensible way at the national level? And equally, how do we make sure that they are supported and equipped and able to resource up to deal with the change that's coming forward as well?
So briefly, Neil Swanson, and then
This partly,
sorry, carry on.
this partly reiterates the point that Scott's made. We've been approached by local authorities who are finding the same problem. They're developing this large asset base. Obviously, the free charging has been a drawdown in their revenue. That's coming to an end, and that's only sensible. But at the moment, it's usually people who are doing this not as their day job. It's just an extra function that's been put on them. It's not an extra function. It's a dedicated full-time job. A dedicated person is required to drive it. And it's not a revenue cost that the local authorities can meet. It's not being driven in a way they can properly support at that level. We have the assets, but in terms of the support within the authority to maintain and promote those assets, that's a different challenge, and that's one we maybe need to step up to more.
Jamie Halgo-Johnson and Gordon MacDonald had, I think, brief supplementary before we come back to Andy Whiteman.
Yeah, very briefly. I mean, you talked about the kind of hogging of charging points, but also talked about Scotland having a high level. I was just wondering if you had any figures for the actual usage, usage of charging points in terms of percentage of their time. I imagine London's might have just slightly more, but they'll be a lot busier.
It's a challenge. In Dundee has the biggest charging hub that's functional in Scotland at the moment, and its utilisation is sitting at about 10%. And that's an interestingly small number. It will have changed since that was out last year. In terms of the capacity of that substation, they are using less than half the available capacity of the substation with the chargers, and it was sized for it. So there's a learning curve there as well. But in terms of charger use, it will vary from place to place. If you pick things up the electric A9, you'll see fairly busy chargers. But you could then travel down to the borders and be comfortable. You can walk up to a single charger point and nobody will be using it because the infrastructure's not quite giving people the confidence. It's coming, and it's coming fast.
Do you have just wondering, is there kind of an estimate of kind of per mile cost in terms of the infrastructure? I mean, obviously you talk about the A9, which is planned electric highway, and there's other roads like the A96 which have been upgraded. It's not just putting the charging points; it's putting the space in for the charging points. It's so is there any kind of?
I don't. That might be something Transport Scotland or possibly EST could provide. But again, from the association's point of view, we also look at that. If you're going to put these things in, people will stop. They will charge. You don't just want them to sit in their cars. You want them to engage in the local community. If Ollie buys a packet of Polos, that's still a win. And there is the opportunity to get them to do more and explore the local area. So it's quite a mixed bag of what we want to do. But no, I'm not aware of a figure.
Can I ask just very quickly? I mean, we've seen recently, I think it was Apple saying they're going to change the Lightning charger, and there was lots of people stung with Betamax. Is the technology that's being used now, the charging technology, are we at risk of investing heavily in this infrastructure and the technology, finding that actually the future in 20 years' time or 10 years' time is a different, better technology? Or
no, I think the current standard, the Type 2 charger, is now mandated for all European manufactured vehicles, and you see most imported vehicles coming with it for the AC charging. DC charging, there are two standards. The European standard is actually both of them. The bulk of European manufacturers use the combined charge system, and it's China and Japan maintain CHAdeMO. You will see the majority of cars go CCS. Things that might change will be things like inductive charging. You may have seen the trial for taxis in Nottingham that was announced a couple of weeks ago. It's been going in Norway for a wee while, and East Lothian again are looking at that type of thing. That deals with a very specific set of problems. It adds a cost to the vehicle, companies like Connected Care, who are looking at 5G networks with charging, but the basic connective charge, no, that's not likely to shift.
And Gordon MacDonald.
Thanks so much. I was wanting to ask if we've talked this morning about upgrading the grid. We've talked about we need a lot more charging points. Has anybody got a ballpark figure of how much this is going to cost?
I don't, but the Committee for Climate Change last year suggested that for the UK, the cost for charging infrastructure, this is not the grid, this is just charging infrastructure by 2050 could be £9 billion. Now, the one thing this sector is not short of is statistics, okay, and they're all different, yeah. So, you know, I wouldn't put a massive amount of weight in that, but it's as good a figure, you know, as anyone can come up with.
Right.
So in Scotland specifically, certainly in the sort of medium term, we're looking at sort of 200 to 300 million pounds in terms of grid infrastructure to support the public charging infrastructure. That's assuming as well that we can do this smartly. So that's with a sort of 40% saving coming out of releasing capacity on the grid and changing people's behaviour. So that could be 40% higher if everybody wants full access. I think one example of where the sort of to the point about uncertainty that was made, we put forward a case recently to the regulator to invest £42 million, which would have facilitated installing monitoring on the distribution system to give better learning and understanding of how EVs impacted the grid. It would have been recovered over 45 years at less than that 4% return over the 45 years and would have cost the consumer annually 2 pence. But the regulator refused that submission, which would have been a huge step forward in terms of actual physical engineering learning that would have allowed us to provide greater certainty on investment requirements. There's a secondary point as well. When we've looked at in Scotland the upgrade of the grid along with estimates of the charging infrastructure that would be required and taking into account the additional electricity consumption, from the transfer of people out of diesel and petrol, we recognise that on the average family GDP, there's about £1,000 per annum saving. And even if you took a large slice of that to replace fuel duty, that's still a material price to go after. So the switch from petrol into electric looks to save families in terms of their budgets as well, which is an important point. This is not one-dimensional about the investment in infrastructure to support this transformation. There is a saving in another dimension, and our whole energy planning needs to take account of that transfer too.
I accept in the short term there's this substantial saving, but we're looking at a situation where you've just identified 2 large areas of investment that's required. The UK government, looking at the figures from the OBR this morning, gets 6.5 billion from vehicle excise duty, which EV vehicles are exempt. They get 28 billion this year from fuel duty, plus the 20% VAT on top of that takes it up to 34 billion. That's a total of 40 billion that comes from petrol diesel vehicles, and that's 5% of the UK government's income. So in the short term there is a saving, but how do we move this forward, that we get the £9 billion that you require for electrical charging across the UK? We need something in the region of 3 billion for grid upgrades if you take your Scotland figure and multiply it by a factor of 10, and yet we're going to be losing £40 billion of income. How do you balance that? Who pays? Who contributes in order to make those economics work?
Thank you. I think they're very valid points, and there is undoubtedly going to be a big loss of fuel duty. And although there's VAT at 5% in electricity, there's going to be a big gap. One point I'd like to make is that, you know, we talked about utilisation, but in the future, this should be an area where you can get private sector investment. So these numbers we're talking about are not necessarily all going to have to come from the public sector funding or finance. Right. There's likely to be areas such as workplace charging and destination charging. That's charging outside, for example, a pub or a restaurant where the private sector will invest. Right now they're investing, recognising they'll make a loss, but they're investing for the future. But in the future they'll be investing because they're confident they can make the return.
But in order to get that cultural change, people need to see the benefit. If you strip out fuel duty rebate, then the cost per mile of using a petrol vehicle based on 35 miles per gallon is roughly 7p. And if you look at, according to the figures I've been given, £8.40 for a 200-mile charge overnight, that's roughly 4p. The average saving for a family is £336 a year. Now, the figures for an e-Golf is 31 grand for an electric vehicle, but if you get the petrol vehicle, it's 23,000. So there's a third increase, 8 grand, and your payback per year is £336. The economics for an ordinary family don't appear to work.
So at the moment, so you've got a high technology price because of a relatively low uptake, and I mentioned earlier that most consensus forecasts are by around about 2023-24 it will be more cost effective to purchase an electric vehicle. Of course it's higher at the moment just because of lower adoption rates. But I think you've got to take a step back. So I certainly from work that we've done, we would say that the saving per family, average family, is about 3 times the value you've quoted. And I would think that that provides some headroom to look at a new form of fuel duty. But equally, are we going to say that replacement fuel duty is not the reason that we'll tackle climate change? There are other benefits that I think that we've got to recognise through this transition. Yeah. The health savings within our city from lower emissions within our city environments. Certainly living and being brought up in Glasgow, right in the centre of Hope Street, is one of the worst areas for pollution in the whole of Europe.
Don't get me wrong, I agree with you that the climate change aspect has to be tackled, but I don't think it's helpful for the likes of what you said in evidence that EV could provide a customer fuel savings of over £1,000. In the very short term, you are correct. But if the government has got to find a way to backfill the loss in excise duty and fuel duty rebate, then that £1,000 isn't reality in the long term.
Well, this is where I was going to commend the Scottish Government for another piece of work that it's doing that I think is vitally important, and that's the just transition work. So with the development of the low carbon future, and again, that's why Stephen's points are important in both heat and transport system, from apprenticeships through to engineering, through to technical, through to planning resource, there is a huge opportunity for GDP development if Scotland takes a leadership position as well. And that's well beyond the grid infrastructure area that I work within. So there is a piece of work that we did with Strathclyde University, and I think this is vitally important. So Professor Karen Turner, who may be asked to give evidence in the future, I'm not sure, but she highlighted that effective planning of infrastructure delivery to support the electrification of transport and heat systems could deliver 0.5% growth on Scottish GDP. If that is properly planned. If we leave it and we become reactive and it's a shock to the economy, it will increase the overall cost.
Okay, thanks so much.
Sorry, back to Andy Whiteman.
Wrap up some questions on the charging infrastructure. We heard from the electrical vehicle users we met in Stirling, a couple of us on the committee, that there's problems with the existing Charge Place Scotland app and the sort of back office functions and lack of reliability and lack of certainty as to whether you can use some of these chargers even if they say they're working, etc. I mean, how can we resolve that? Because the kind of, at the moment, if you're using a diesel vehicle, you're confident that if you go to a petrol station, there'll be some petrol and you can fill up. It's very, very rare that it wouldn't be. You have to have that same level of confidence if you're travelling about. So how can we improve that?
The contract to run the e-mobility service provider, the back office for Charge Place Scotland, is currently going out to tender. It's a very competitive marketplace. There are some really interesting products out there. The back office provider doesn't own any of the hardware. The hardware belongs to the charge point operators, who are also frustrated in the same way the drivers are, because they don't always have the ability to see if their asset is working in a position to generate revenue or not. So moving over to a more integrated back office is something that we've driven with Transport Scotland to push for some aspects added to the contract to make it more reliable for the end user, to make it more visible, and to bring in things like interoperability, roaming across different networks. You shouldn't need a card for each and every network you drive onto. It should be as simple as drive up, plug in, and some of the modern cars, you don't even need the card, swipe, charge, and it appears on your monthly bill. We have the contactless payment, which gives an ad hoc version of the same access that's now coming mandated on all new rapid chargers. But in terms of the broader network, one card and roaming is the way to go. And you'll see cars coming, will start having on board the sat-nav the state of charge points nearby, much in the same way as if you buy the high-end cars like Tesla, you will have. That was something that will start appearing in more cars, and it will give consumers a lot more confidence. In terms of the app and the mapping, that just requires the back office updated and brought up to what you can see as a more modern standard.
And how long does that contract last?
Till July.
No, but it's going out to tender, so how will it be? Will it be a 2 year, 3 year, 4, 5 year?
I think it's 3 with potential for 2 single-year extensions.
Okay. And at the moment, the free charge place, charge point, this charge stuff.
Free power.
It's free on many of these chargers.
It's free on many.
Who's paying for that?
At the moment, the charge point owner, whoever that is, on the Charge Place Scotland network, there's over 250 charge point owners, operators, and they pay for the energy that's consumed. The bulk of the charge points belong to local authorities.
So local government is paying for the electricity that people use.
Yes.
That's not sustainable, is it?
Oh God, no. No.
When's that going to end?
It's beginning to end. So Dundee, for example, now has a tariff for visitors of the city. Residents continue to benefit from free charging within the city. Fife will be bringing theirs in this year. East Lothian comes in March. Okay. Edinburgh have announced theirs. It's due in this year as well. Murray has always charged. Highland is looking at it. Orkney brought a charge in last May. So gradually we're seeing it roll out. What we're not seeing though is universal application of tariffs. If you want to charge in Edinburgh, it will be a lot more expensive than charging in Dundee or Orkney. And there's the balance. We were talking about charger hogging earlier. We issued a guidance document that's available on our website for anyone who's thinking about implementing a tariff, to try and give the behavioural nudge to get people to use the right assets in the right way, including things like overstay fees. Use a rapid charger for 45 minutes, but when you go over 45 minutes, you enter a period of you've stayed too long. This will now cost you extra, not a penalty, just a fee for staying too long. That will encourage people to move on quickly, which means from the asset owner's point of view, they'll see a greater turnover and improve their revenue stream. And it's what's needed to get people to use the right charger. If you need a slow charge or a little, go and use a lower powered unit. If you need it quickly, you'll pay a premium to get the higher delivery rate because you've invested in a £50,000 asset in the ground. You can't just have the same charge in each.
So as charging becomes more commonplace, fees become more commonplace, local authorities could begin to generate a modest amount of revenue for these?
Yeah, I would see it more as it'll let them organically grow their network and not run at a loss, and potentially support staff to look after it.
Okay.
I just want to say that I wouldn't see electric vehicle charging as necessarily being an area for local authorities to make significant revenue. Right now, the electricity is a cost, as you rightly identified. It's a relatively small cost, partly because of the scale, number of electric vehicles and how much they're used. But going forward, it's important that we do charge a tariff, and that is because it then makes it more of a commercial proposition. And in terms of the level of service, I think it was mentioned by Neil, I think interoperability is key, because once you get where people can turn up and use different charge points, there's potential to have an element of competition if there's private sector investment, and that tends to raise standards.
Right, I think we have some supplementaries from Dean Lockhart and then Richard Lyle in this area.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, it's on a similar topic. Another issue we discussed at the EV Summit in Stirling was the need for more information to be given to consumers to encourage behavioural change. There's this concern about range anxiety. There's also, I think, a misunderstanding about the relative costs of running an EV car and the potential cost savings, and behavioural change in terms of charging overnight as opposed to charging just when you get back from work, given the relative cost savings. I wonder, are we doing enough to educate the public about EV cars and about the benefits and about things like range anxiety?
So, Energy Saving Trust work with, through the Home Energy Scotland network, to provide consumers with advice on, independent and partial advice on a range of technologies. Electric vehicles are one of those, heating and building efficiency being another, and across the rest of the UK through the Go Ultra Low programme. And this is something that we have done on many different ways, community engagement events, speaking to people on the telephone, and also ourselves up dealing with local authorities, engaging with local authorities, and then sitting down with local interested parties to discuss these very issues. We also try to put a lot of content out there on our webpage to provide people with information and address the very barriers that you're talking about.
Okay. I think a couple of others wanted to come in.
I was just going to make one point. So I think we need to do more in the areas that you said about sort of behaviour, understanding the cost and whatnot, but there's also another aspect where people are installing this equipment. We've got to remember this is electricity infrastructure that's being installed behind the meter. So we need to make sure that the process is safe. If you look at most domestic premises, you'll have a point of isolation that's about 18 kilowatts. Now, a shower will use between 7 and 9 kilowatts. If you have the hob and the oven connected at the same time, that'll be using 6 kilowatts. So that's us up at 15. And then if we plug in an electric charger at 22, if you go for another electric charger, you're significantly over the rating of that asset. So there's a very, very strong piece, I think, to be done in terms of making sure that we do have a coordinated role of this infrastructure that's safe, that's also safe, not just in domestic premises, but in the streets. And it's back to the point that was made earlier about ensuring that it's not just about a maintenance contract for 3 to 5 years, it's also about what does that look like in terms of maintenance operation, what's the licensing regime look like. But there's definitely more needing to be done in terms of socialising all aspects of this infrastructure.
Yeah. Perhaps briefly, Stephen Veer, we're just conscious of time here.
Education, definitely. I am very much for more education in this area. I think one of your points was about the vehicle themselves. Yeah. If you walked into a garage forecourt and until recently, they would certainly be trying to push you a diesel or a petrol car because that's what they have the stock of. Therefore, when people walk in, they're offered the deal. And electric vehicles, my overall evidence is that electric vehicles is not really brought up in the conversation unless people specifically ask about them. The point was raised earlier by Andy about the cost of electric vehicles, and they undoubtedly are at this point of time more costly. But if you look at the whole life cost of the vehicle, and by that I mean the purchase price, the leasing cost, the fuel cost, the insurance, the funding cost, the tax and fees, the maintenance, and the sell-on cost, if you look at that, the picture is not that clear. But people only see right now that upfront costs. I think there is a real point about educating people and making sure they have access to funding arrangements to allow them to basically purchase these vehicles for the long term.
A brief question from Richard Lyle, and then we'll come to questions from the Deputy Convener.
My question to Neil Swanson. The first electric car I got to use when I was on the Rural Affairs Committee ran about 100 miles. Next, now cars are 250. Have you seen the Daily Mail report of a former Royal Naval officer turned inventor, Trevor Jackson, has developed an incredible electric car battery that lasts for 1,500 miles. Do you think
It's
that's going to be the
disposable.
case?
It may well be the case, but it's a disposable device. It's effectively a resource user. When it's flat, you have to get a new one.
So you would really need to buy a new battery all the time?
Yes, and it consumes it. One of the great things about the batteries is they are largely recyclable. I know that some of you have spoken to Ewan McTurk, who talks about this at length. The battery is recycled, but before it's recycled, it can be reused. That's one use, and then
You're saying his battery is only one use?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Deputy Convener.
Thanks very much, Convener. I wonder if I could just get your views on the impacts in the rural community, rural environment. I mean, as you know, garages and so on, petrol stations are very often the hub of small villages. It's not just about fuel, it's about services, retail, even banking. What can you see? Can you look a little bit into the near future and kind of paint a picture of what Scotland might look like? Will these garages disappear, or will they have to kind of repurpose themselves to become something else entirely, do you think?
They'll become different, yes, but they may provide charging. We'd like to encourage more people, and this is something I know that the EST do as well, is businesses need to engage with this. You don't want people to stop and just charge and leave. You want them to charge and maybe have a meal, have a snack. So you still have a garage that will sell those things. It just won't be providing fuel. There is potential there to actually grow local economy, because people will stop, and while they're charging, they'll explore. They may do more in the community. And it is a potential area to grow local economies.
Fuel companies who presumably own most of the forecourts, what's their interest in maintaining this infrastructure if they're no longer selling fuel and it's electric?
I think it's probably fairly clear that most forecourts make money out of the products they sell in the shop, not the fuel. It gets a little different in rural areas where the balance is different, but by having the EV infrastructure in place, it will reduce their overheads potentially. They're not having to have fuel delivered in the conventional sense. There will be network issues, as Scott's pointed out, but in terms of local community, you may see it move from being a conventional forecourt to more of an enhanced local shop, which will benefit the local community as well as drivers.
Stephen?
I think the fuel companies see this coming, and therefore they're looking at not just the future of rural communities, but their future as well. I think it's a very important point you make, and I think rural communities, there are different challenges there from what there are in the cities, such as Dundee and Edinburgh, and I believe that there is a need to look at, therefore, how we, channel our support to the areas that most need it, that are less likely to be commercially delivered.
Just during your discussion there, I was looking at the Charge Place Scotland website there. It looks as though there's charging points all over the country, but are we okay with what's being done in the rural communities to make sure that they're not left behind, as many, sometimes they very often are?
I think that's a big anxiety that we've got. So it's very easy to see private providers of charging infrastructure, and there are many beyond ChargePoint Scotland we're focused on, but there are also companies like Ecotricity, etc., who provide chargers under a merchant model throughout Scotland as well, and in these areas. I think big anxiety that we've got as a networks provider is we know that our service has to be universal, whether you're in a rural community or in an urban environment. How do we make sure that that charging infrastructure is the same? And I think that has got to be dealt with. So again, the two local authorities that we've chosen in this project have rural areas as well as urban conurbations to try and test that proposition. I think the other point, which we touched on earlier in the just transition, just to come back to that point, is a vital one, is we can't think about the way that we did things in the past with the fuel stations. We've got to think about the fitters, installers, those who will maintain a much larger proportion of infrastructure that will be in our rural communities. The value of electricity, if it's used for heat and transport in rural communities, will grow, and it will mean there will be employment opportunities for those who fit, maintain and secure that infrastructure in local communities too.
Okay, good. And lastly, on the European dimension to this, I think, Neil, you said that it's Type 2 chargers are commonplace right across Europe.
That's
so
the
there's
mandated DC charging standard for cars manufactured
there'll
in
be no
Europe.
issue about being able to use your cars throughout Europe and so on and so forth.
Not currently,
be
no.
able to exchange. And as that technology develops, will there be some kind of sense, do you think, of trying to keep pace, close the connections with what's happening with the technology?
I think because the car manufacturing base is largely outside the UK, it will stay that way. If you take Jaguar Land Rover as an example, their electric vehicles obviously manufactured in Hungary. So it's mandated that it will be manufactured with a Type 2 charger. And CCS is an option, but the AC charging will remain constant. Worldwide, there are only really 2 functional standards for charging vehicles. Type 1, which applies in Japan, the United States, principally, Canada, North America, and Type 2, which is almost everywhere else.
Okay. Okay, thanks very much for that. Thank you.
Jackie Bailey. Sorry.
Yep, finished.
Jackie Bailey.
Thank you very much, Convener. Can I direct my initial questions to the Energy Savings Trust, because I'm interested in some of the data, and if you can't supply it, please do write into the committee. In 2017, there were 7,509 EVs registered. How many of them benefited from an interest-free loan, and do you have indicative figures for 2018 and 2019?
So I wouldn't have answers to the first question, but I should have for the latter, if you just give me 1 second. So indicative figures for 2019 would be 45 million total value, and that's up to 35,000 for any ULEV, including battery electric vehicles, plug-in hybrids, and some range extended vehicles. And that's forecast to be equivalent to in excess of 1,300 individual vehicles, some of whom will be taxi and private hire vehicles as well.
Would it be possible to get a breakdown? Because what I'm driving at is, if I as a vehicle owner wanted to switch, how would I know about your services? Would I perhaps not be able to find out about them and I would just march in and buy one myself? So, how many you've provided interest-free loans for, the type of vehicles, is it a taxi, is it a private car, and the context of how many overall were registered would be very useful for the committee to understand the dynamics. Can I take you forward to how an EV loan scheme would work for second-hand cars? Because obviously there are practical things, like if you're standing at a garage forecourt, you're about to buy a car, how long would it take for the loan to come through to make that a practical thing to do?
So the specifics around used vehicle loans are still being discussed with Transport Scotland, so I don't think I could go into any detail on that just now, but it is being considered, so we should have more detail available in the next month or two.
Okay. Again, I think the committee would be interested in receiving that. I wonder if the panel have anything to suggest to inform thinking about how that second-hand scheme would work. Neil Swanson.
Yeah, we've spoken to dealerships, and one of our members specialises in selling second-hand electric vehicles. The big issue for the dealers is that they really need to turn around quite quickly on the loan. Most of them will accept 7 to 9 days, but they're actually at the point now where they can sell the car off the forecourt for cash surprisingly quickly. And I think we do need to support the people who need to take the interest-free loan to be able to achieve the purchase of an electric vehicle. Things like a PCP is not always an option for them, and this opens up a huge market for delivering electric vehicles to people who will benefit most from them.
Okay. And do you think the scheme should apply just to those that are solely electric vehicles, or the ones that are hybrids?
From a personal point of view, I think it should be pure electric vehicles.
Okay.
But I think that's a policy decision within TS.
We look forward to hearing more about it in due course. Can I ask all of the panel, what further initiatives do you think should be considered to encourage the switch? I'm thinking of things like, we're all very used to going into a petrol station. Would you have charging points there? Are there perhaps changes to import duty, access to bus lanes, anything like that you think would help? Neil Swanson.
One of the big things here is children. Incredibly enough, they are very aware of what's going on. We're all seeing them marching on television, upset with the state of this planet. One of the stories we have is from the late Davy Young up in Dundee, whose 2030-20 taxi fleet went largely electric. That came on the back of his grandchildren telling him off for driving dirty petrol cars. That level of pester power and understanding is underrated, and I think we could make a lot more of it. So education at the school level will really drive this. parents are choosing to choose an electric car because their kids are telling them it's too dirty, you're polluting the place, you're hurting me. And it's true. And that's something that's a strength that should be used.
I've never heard it described as pester power. I shall use that in future. Any other responses?
I can just say regarding Neil Point, my children are already pestering me, so there you go. The point I would make is, I think we need a culture change, but I think we're seeing that. I certainly noticed in the last, not just the electric vehicle, just the carbon agenda, a big difference in the last year. I think regulation always helps. So these net zero zones, I think they're going to make a big difference if people actually cannot enter, city centres unless they have an appropriate vehicle.
Okay. Sorry.
Just one final thing. A lot of people drive around not realising that there are electric vehicle charge points everywhere. You've looked at the map, you've seen how prevalent they are. One of the things we ask for, and it is beginning to come through, the new station in Glasgow has a sign indicating it has a charge point at it out on the trunk routes. So having signs on the trunk roads that tell people there's a charge point in a given distance and where to turn off to go for it, you're not advertising beyond that the network is there. The awareness will come, and people who are afraid of having an electric vehicle or driving up and down the roads are going to see signage telling them it's there. That is going to give them range confidence. We don't like to talk about range anxiety. We like to talk about range confidence, and that is a surprisingly big driver for it, being able to see where the assets are.
Okay, thank you very much, Convener.
Right, thank you. We still have literally a couple of minutes, and Jamie Halker-Johnson and Gordon MacDonald wanted to follow with very brief questions, if we could.
Yeah, we've tended to focus on the domestic, but obviously there's a huge amount of commercial vehicles out there. I was just wondering how much impact could be done if we were, given a lot of these are company vehicles, perhaps particularly larger companies like the Royal Mail, how important the changing those to electric vehicles could be in terms of impact?
Well, sorry, are you talking in terms of the grid or in terms of usage?
Well, both. I mean, but they may have more of a ability to provide the infrastructure themselves in depots and the like.
Well, our perception is that you term those a return to base fleet. They charge overnight. So they actually offer potentially, don't want to call it a revenue stream, but because that can be controlled within the depot, smart charging, and potential for vehicle to grid as well, returning power to the grid to meet demand overnight. This is an exciting area. Scott's desperate to join in, and I'm not surprised. They have potential to save these businesses money.
Yeah. But is there a great enough focus on that? I mean, because obviously today, and a lot of it's about domestic use or private use.
There are already companies out there with products to sell to these fleet businesses. The vehicles are a little slower coming, but they are coming. I think it's London. There's the large fleet of electric buses down in London. The SSE put in, it's quite a large demand, as Scott was describing earlier, but they can control that, and effectively, if they reduce their demand, they can get the same energy delivered overnight, but possibly at a lower cost. But yes, there's more to come, and that's something that the networks businesses are going to have to work with third parties on in a big way.
Okay.
All right, we may be desperate to say more things, but it's open to any of you to write into the committee to amplify what you've said here today, or to add to any of these issues if you want to make further comment. However, a final last question to Gordon MacDonald briefly.
Just a very quick clarification I'm looking for. A couple of times it's been said that these public charging points will have a local economic impact. And I'm looking at a proposal from a company called GridServe, which is talking about putting in the world's fastest charging points, but then goes on to say the bays will charge most electric and hybrid models within half an hour. So you're basically saying that it will have a local economic impact because folk will need to find something to do with the extra 25 minutes it's going to take to charge their vehicle.
Potentially, yeah.
Right, okay.
But you're asking me to predict how people will behave.
Yeah.
It's up to whoever installs the asset. You put in units at different price points, you'll get people with different drivers coming in. If somebody's coming through in a transit position, they'll want to charge fast and go, it's business. People with a family, inevitably that will incur a toilet break. So a slower charge rate at a lower cost, they'll stay longer. They may go and spend or explore the local area. They may come back later having seen something they liked. It's very difficult for us in an association to quantify. That's quite a major piece of research.
I mean, I accept that. It's just the fact you mentioned about the local economic impact. I wanted the clarification.
Yeah.
That was
Certainly we're seeing bed and breakfasts putting in charge points to encourage people with EVs to stay.
okay.
Just as a final addendum on that, you're talking about a 200 to 300 kilowatt charger and multiples of them. I highlighted the impact of the bus depot with the 80 kilowatt chargers. That's a significant material impact if there was a large proliferation of them. And what you tend to find with the very high capacity chargers is they have low utilisation rates. So ChargePoint Scotland, you see the lower rated chargers having high utilisation and the higher rated lower, but more visits. Interesting.
All right. Thank you very much. I think we're out of time now. As I say, please feel free to write in if there are further issues you want to cover for the committee. Thank you very much for coming in today. I'll suspend the meeting briefly to allow for a changeover of witnesses to our next panel. Thank you. Well, welcome back to our meeting. We're now on item 3 of the agenda on protected trust deeds, and I'll introduce our witnesses. First of all, starting from my left to right, we have Mike Holmyard, who's the Financial Health Policy Manager at Citizens Advice Scotland, Bob Russell, who's the Debt Advice Officer at Falkirk Council, Anna Hamilton, who's the Money Advice Manager at Citizens Advice in Edinburgh, and last but not least, Lee Kilgallen, who's a Debt Advisor with City of Edinburgh Council. So, if I might start before we come to questions from other committee members, we've heard sort of a variety of evidence on protected trust deeds so far, and I'm just wondering, are you able to give us some view on what the level of difficulty there is with protected trust deeds and their operation? I mean, there's always isolated individual cases in anything that may have gone very badly for individuals involved. But in the case of protected trust deeds, can you give us an overall picture of how they're working and whether there are serious problems that go beyond perhaps one individual case or more going wrong? Who would like to start on that one? Mike Holmyard.
I don't think there's any hard and fast statistics about how many people are badly affected by trust deeds. But if we look at, for example, in the CAB network, the number of advisors that have come to us with issues and cases, individual cases, fair enough, with a particular problem, issues around what happens when the trust deed fails, issues about whether they should have been on a trust deed in the first place. There seems to be enough of a continuous stream of reports of detriment there that would indicate to us that there is a problem that needs to be resolved. We're not here to bury trust deeds. We realise that they have a place in the advice landscape that we've got. Apart from anything else, the free advice sector does not have the capacity to meet the demand if there was no trust deeds and there was no commercial sector. We've been here before to talk about funding of the debt advice sector and how difficult it is just now for the free advice sector in particular. So what we're here to say, though, is that there is difficulties in some firms, I think, would be fair to say, who do not handle consumers very well. There may be some fundamental issues around the whole construction of a trust deed in itself, given that it's based on insolvency law, common law, statute, but there's no consumer law bit to it. And so what we're here today to talk about really is how these kind of issues at the edges need to be firmed up a bit to make the trust deed market a lot more healthier.
Right, Lee Kilgallen.
Yeah, I think there's nothing there that I would disagree with. I mean, I think as a practitioner for the last 15, 16 years for the money advice, for the debt advice team and for the local authority, I've seen significant changes from when I first started, where we had 19 money advisors, debt advisors, to now recently having 5 or 6, with the complexity of client group coming in being probably more so now than ever before. Protected trust deeds have always had a place, and I think should always have a place. However, we have, I suppose the best way I could example that would be, as a practitioner, I've only made 1 or 2 referrals in the past 5 or 6 years regarding to a protected trust deed. And the reasons for that is, I think, for some of the points that Mike alluded to, that the concerns we have about the signing of trust deeds, the appropriateness of trust deeds, are people getting the full picture of their debts taking into account? Are they being listened to in regarding to their primary debts, their priority debts, for example, if there's a court case for rent arrears? And a lot of these things are overlooked and suggested that will be okay in a trust deed, and when trust deeds fail, they tend to be difficult for us then to do anything about it. So we only tend to see the trustees when they fail. I suppose there's a skewed opinion of the trustees in a certain degree. However, when we do see them fail, they tend to fail very, very badly, and people are in a situation where they think they're going somewhere for help and simply not getting that help.
On that point, I mean, we've heard some evidence about the amount of fees or fixed fees that in some cases mean that when they fail or when they do fail, then effectively none of the debt has been paid off, but fees have been paid. I mean, is that an issue?
Well, yes, I think when you set up a trust deed, previously 3-year trust deed, now 4 years, potentially 5-year trust deed, or beyond, if there's a property, an owned property, when you look at a trust deed as it stands just now, the trust deed, for argument's sake, will pay £150 per month over a 4-year period, with additional, if there's a own property, to buy equity in the 5th and final year. Now, my understanding of that, the primary concern of any client going into that is, will I lose my house? Is the first question people ask me in any surgery I've ever done. And these questions don't seem to be getting addressed, in my opinion, where a trust deed is looking at the first year fees to be taking any contribution, cover their fees. At the very least should be a percentage to cover fees, creditor payments, and looking at buying out equity, to concern the main concern of most clients will have. And if the trustee does fail in year 2 or 3, then a percentage should be applied to fees and the rest written off. So there's not a top-loaded IP fees, and it should be more balanced throughout, in my opinion.
Thank you. And before we come to question, sorry, Bob Russell, you want to come in?
I think for all advisors at Falkirk Council, I think have had experience of a trust deed coming back to us that should never have been a trust deed in the first place. It's not been viable, it's not been sustainable, there's never been the money to pay for it, and it's ended up coming back X amount of months and money later and going to be a bankruptcy, which is what it should have been in the first place. That's one issue. Again, I would agree with the point about the equity. I mean, sometimes the equity is left to be resolved at the end, and from the client's point of view, that's completely unsatisfactory. That should be, the client should know what exactly they're having to pay and what they're getting for it. You can't just say, oh, well, we'll deal with equity at the end. That's no use to the client.
Before we come to questions from Jackie Bailey, Richard Lyle had a brief follow-up to one of these issues. Richard Lyle.
Sorry, I thought Jackie Bailey. Organisations operate. There are organisations who operate protected trustees. They're suggesting that everything in the garden is rosy. Is it right that a company takes payments from a debtor for 18 months but doesn't send one penny to the creditor till after that period, even if they do send in to the creditor after that period? Is that right?
I would say that there has to be a balance in all things, and I'm not here to stand up for insolvency practitioners at all. I'm here to stand up for debtors, quite frankly. But I do understand that insolvency practitioners' fees do tend to be front-loaded. The majority of their work's done at the front, as it is with any debt advice process. The work that is done in the early stages, the fact-finding, the understanding the client's position, what's available for given to creditors.
Do more work than they do.
Yep.
Yeah. Right.
Can
time is going on, and I need to get this in. Should fees be more regulated and be paid 50-50? 50% to the organisation and 50% to the creditor as the debtor makes a payment each month?
I personally don't really mind how those fees are paid. The debtor is the person I want to see with the outcome that satisfies. Creditors are agreeing to these trust deeds. So what the creditor chooses to agree to there is that the front end of the fees will be collected by the trustee, and the creditor will get what's surplus, essentially. At the end of the day, the debtor should be discharged without any further requirement to pay towards those debts, because that has been what's agreed. Our issue tends to be when debtors come to us who are either being recommended this product when it's not really the best product for them in the situation they're in, or when they've entered into this agreement with the best will in the world and they've started making the payments at the agreed rate, but things change and they then end up with much more severe detriment than they should have, in my view.
Garland, you want to come in there?
Yeah, I just agree with Anna's point there. As a debt advisor, my primary concern is to make sure the client has the best deal on the table that's possible. And that's my primary concern. So I don't really have an opinion on whether it's that important, whether the trustee or the creditors get their first share of the money within the first couple of years. What I would suggest is that if there's a owned property and going to be dealt with at the end of the trust deed, that should be brought into the balance at the front of the trust deed. So that is also part of the equation, where the potential for the client's home is going to be safeguarded. So even when it is, if it does potentially fail, there's still that potential for the client not necessarily to lose their home.
All right, we'll come on to questions from Jackie Bailey now.
Thank you very much, Convener. We ran a focus group in Greenock just, I think, about a week or 2 weeks ago, and it was really interesting because some of the issues raised, were about the entire trust deed process, but actually many of them were right at the beginning, at entry point to the process, and a number of people raised concerns about whether they knew what they were getting into. So there are potential solutions to this, and I wonder whether I could just put them to you and get your view on what you think would work. So firstly, somebody suggested that all the lead generators should be FCA regulated. Another suggestion was that insolvency practitioners are banned from accepting paid-for referrals. Another one, that debtors must receive advice from a free sector money advisor before entering a protected trust deed so that the disposal would be right. I recognise there might be a need for increase in capacity if we were to do that. And lastly, that some kind of official leaflet should be developed and supplied to anyone contacted about a protected trust deed. What's your view on that? And are there other solutions that we haven't considered? Mike?
Coming back to should there be an official leaflet, there is actually one. It's called the Debt Advice and Information Package, and it's meant to be handed out to every potential protected trustee client. It's not particularly helpful, a document. It basically says that you're in a serious situation and you should seek advice. So there is an official document that exists. In terms of the other solutions that people came up with, I think lead generation in particularly has been a big problem in this sector. And the AIB tried to deal with lead generation in 2013 by changing the regulations so that, because what was happening prior to 2013 was fees being charged by lead generators were actually being added onto the trust deed as an upfront cost. So in 2013, this Parliament changed the regulations so that that couldn't happen. So you can see the AIB's direction of travel was to exclude these people from the market. SIP 3.3, which is referred to quite often as well by the insolvency practitioners, actually also says that it's not acceptable to accept leads. So, in fact, I'll quote exactly what it says here, because I think this is quite important. The special nature of insolvency appointments makes the payment for or offer of commission for or the furnishing of any valuable consideration towards the introduction of insolvency appointments inappropriate. So their own insolvency practice precludes lead generation. So I think that regulating them by the FCA is a positive step, but I don't know why they're in the market at all, because clearly everybody is trying to move away from that kind of model. And I would question the value of lead generators in this process, because they don't appear to be doing anybody any good. They don't do the debtors particularly any service, because they are they earn the money effectively from a protected trusted referral. That's where most of the money comes from for their business. So the debtor can't be assured that they're getting full advice. When it goes to the insolvency practitioner, they are responsible for the advice of the lead generator, so they have to check everything that the lead generator has done, plus they have to pay fees to them. The creditor is then losing out because those fees have to come from somewhere. So at the end of the day, what value do lead generators add to this process? And I would be advocating that we should actually remove lead generators altogether from the insolvency business. I don't think they're helping at all.
Okay. Bob Russell.
I would agree with that last point, and I would also think that the free advice sector could give initial advice, provided that was properly funded. That would be as you said yourself, that would be the big point about that. Because there have been a lot of cuts, as everybody knows, in the provision of debt advice.
Okay, that's very helpful. Lee Kilgallen.
Yes, again, I would strongly agree with Mike. The purpose of the lead generator is simply to fund the lead generator's pocket. In some cases, £1,000 to £1,500, I believe, figures that are being quoted for effectively cold calling people that are in their most dire need. As a practitioner, I see people in surgeries that are the lowest possible, suicidal sometimes. And when you're dealing with that type of client group who feel they're on the verge of losing everything, their home, their family, they will sign up to whatever you ask them to sign up to because they are trusting you to tell them the right things. And when they get a way out, then they'll take that way out, whether that's the way out for them or not. And I'm not saying the trustee is not the way out for them. That may well be the correct option for them. But the option, the trustees who fail and come to me in my surgery where they have badly failed, the situation is worse. And at times, I'm unable to then stop it because they're now protected, signed this legal document. And as was previously mentioned, should not have even been considered for a trustee in the first place. I strongly believe that the free money sector should be giving advice on these issues. If you look at a bankruptcy, if you look at a DAS, these are unable to contact, unable to, for a client to go into that on their own without having advice, without having the correct levels of advice. Trusted is somehow different. Why is that different? That concerns me. Working for the money advice team, the debt advice team within the local council, if you want us to do that, then there's significantly more funding needed.
Can I just press you on that? Because obviously, you know, people have been to this committee before and said there's a lack of funds. Are you talking double the current capacity? What kind of order of magnitude are you talking?
I don't have the stats. If my boss was sitting here, he'd be shouting at me for not bringing the stats.
You can write him.
Yes. So, because that's probably the best opportunity. But when I started 15 years ago, there were 19 full-time money advisors in the advice shop. In the advice shop, I'm sure, hopefully you guys know the advice shop and heard the advice shop and referred your constituencies to the advice shop. I've been there 15 years. We now have, until recently, 3 money advisors, 3 debt advisors. We've just recently appointed 3 new money advisors, debt advisors, to the point that they will take 6 months to a year to get up to speed before they are competent to do the job that we're at for the court representation and the stuff that we're talking about just now. And if I was to say, to go back to the days when there was 19 money advisors, I don't see that in my lifetime. However, I would like to see that a significant amount of money additional to have us more, and not just about the staff on the grounds, it's the training that goes with that. It's the knowledge that we have in the advice shop to do training in other surgeries and other areas of Edinburgh, the re-education, the schools, the prisons that we work in, the surgeries, the citizens advice bureaus that we work in conjunction with, the community centres where we have surgeries but we've had to withdraw because of lack of funding. That's where we need to be. And with more money advisors, we'll be able to do that.
Does Anna Hamilton have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I would totally back what Lee said. In terms of the resourcing for money advice in the sector, at this point in time, there is no way we could take on free advice for, I think it's in the region of 8,000 trustees that are in Scotland this last year. Now, we see a proportion of those. We do see the ones who have problems. Fortunately, we see some people who decide just to have a check if this is the right thing for them, and invariably it wasn't. So we're glad that the clients have actually flagged that for themselves and understood there may be an alternative. So we do deal with the mop-up afterwards. We deal with a few clients who will come and sort of recognise that there might be some other alternative, that this might not be the best for them. But to see everybody would be, that would be a huge leap for the advice sector to take that on. I mean, I don't think Edinburgh is unique in its difficulties with resourcing for money advice. So,
but one would assume if you did the entry advice properly, you'd have fewer failed protected trust deeds. You'd see fewer difficult cases down the line.
Possibly. There are many aspects to how a trust deed might meet as failure. I think that in a number of cases, they shouldn't have been issued in the first place. There should not have been a trust deed. In other cases, there isn't enough foresight when looking at the product that's been recommended to the client. So there are clearly changes likely to happen in this person's circumstances in the near future that are going to make it impossible to manage this for 4 years. And those are sometimes not recognised. And then there are others where there's a catastrophic change in circumstances that can happen to anyone at any time and can't have been foreseen. And those cases sometimes I don't think are dealt with appropriately at that stage. And we pick up the pieces on all of those events.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Mayor. Can I begin by just asking a very simple question, or I hope it is. A person has a protected trust deed, and let's say it runs for 4 years. They die partway through that. What happens?
There's a claim made on the estate of the dead person. So if they had property, for example, the funds from the property would be used to pay the trust deed. So trust deed would be paid in full, plus interest, statutory interest, plus the IP's fees as well. So potentially that person, the deceased person's estate, would have to pay much more than the value of their actual original debt.
Are you saying it's effectively treated as a default?
Yeah, but if there's an estate to make a claim against, if there's an insurance policy to make a claim against, yeah. So the situation is that they've contracted to pay back as much of their debt as possible under this protected trust deed. The situation has changed, the person has died, there is an asset that can be claimed against, and the debts are paid in full. I'm not saying that's right, but that's what actually happens.
It may be legally the case, but is it fair?
No, there's other unfair situations like that.
Such as?
Well, give an example. Since we submitted our evidence to you, we had one case reported to us where a Glasgow Council female employee entered into a protected trust deed at the end of 2018, when it was well known that a lump sum payment for underpayment of wages was due. The lump sum was paid. The lady tried to make an attempt to pay off what she thought was her debt, which was around about £12,000. However, the trustee at that point became aware that she had received her back payment. Bear in mind, this was a Glasgow firm, so they should have known that this was going to happen. Demanded another 12,000 on top of what she'd already paid to cover their own fees. So there are a number of unfair situations like this which tend to happen when people come into money or assets that they didn't expect to. This is what, coming back to what Anna said, there's two sides of unexpected things. One is unexpected, income shock that reduces your income to a level where you can no longer maintain a trust deed. The other is unexpected joy, if you like. You win the pools, the lottery or whatever. You come into an inheritance, and in that case, you're expected to pay back your debt in full.
Do you think that, given the fact that since nobody's said otherwise, that it is manifestly unfair, should there be changes to the regulations, legislation, whatever it needs?
I think certainly in the case that you mentioned, the interest of the family should be prioritised. The interest of people who stand to inherit should be prioritised over the debt, yeah.
Does anybody disagree with that? Yeah.
No, I certainly don't disagree. I mean, I think in the instance where there's not a property involved, then any debt that was remaining would pass with the person who passed away. But in a situation where there was an estate, as Mike said, there could be an occasion where the actual amount of money recovered is significantly higher than the original debt level. Now, to cover fees and to cover so on, I can't imagine where that is okay for that to happen, particularly when the family, particularly if it's a family home, and most of the cases where we're dealing with, and certainly the cases I'm dealing with, it's very rare for someone to have a second or third property. It's primarily their family and only home. So if the person was to die, not only the person losing their loved one, they're potentially going to lose their home as well after the trustee has paid the majority, if not all, if not more than the greater sum of the debt. So I believe that part of it fundamentally has to be changed, in my opinion.
Okay. Let me move on just to a slightly different thing. Insolvency practitioners argue that they make a valuable contribution to dealing with demand for debt service. Do you agree?
I would say that the figures for the number of people entering a trust deed suggest that yes, they do, that there is a place for trust deeds for people who are made aware of what they're getting into, the situation that they're getting into, how this is going to help them resolve their financial position, how they're going to be able to have their debts written off at the end of the process, having made their payments as agreed. We see, I would imagine, I don't have figures for the whole of Scotland or anything close to, I don't think anybody has any kind of figures that could tell us what the tip of the iceberg is, the ones who have the problems. Those are the ones we see. And often they've entered into it and it was the right solution. When they've entered into it, it was the right solution. Things have changed, however. So there is a place for them, definitely. There is a place for a version of trust deeds. But I don't think that this version is ideal.
I would agree with that. There definitely is a place for trustees, but it looks to me that clearly there needs to be tighter regulation because there are some abuses, if you want to call it that. I think that's quite clear that that's what's been happening.
Now, I think Mike Homyard actually mentioned about the question of how the fee sector might cope if insolvency commissioners, if insolvency practitioners were not taking on the role they do, and clearly there's resource issues there. What would have to be done for the free sector to cope with that? And would it be cost effective or any more cost effective than what we're seeing now?
The value of debt advice has been looked at by the Money Advice Service, I believe. I can't remember off the top of my head what figure they actually attributed to that. But, you know, for every £1 you invest, you get back sort of £10–15 in a debt advice service. So, yes, there is value in that. Given the fact that we're not charging our clients either for the debt advice process, you know, there's more money being recovered clearly for creditors where it's possible in terms of the arrangements that are set up. So, you know, where they're not paying IP fees and that kind of thing. But I think we also have to recognise, and I'll say this about our own client group, is that our client group has changed significantly over the last 10 years. We've done some work in the last few weeks where we've been looking at the kind of income and expenditure that people are coming to see us with. And we think nearly 50% of the people that come to see us now do not have a disposable income to make payments towards their debt. And that not only in some cases is that they had just enough to get by, it's that there's actually a significant group of people that have a significant deficit on their budgets every month and are having to beg, borrow and steal to get by. So, you know, the question of how much value we could add, you know, if we took over the process, you know, you've got to weigh up all these different factors. The client group is changing. People are getting definitely are definitely worse off than they used to be. But you know, weigh that up against charges that are regularly paid in the IP sector, then it's a different kettle of fish.
Yeah, just again, to go back to briefly your previous point, yeah, I think, as the panel says, there's a place for trustees, there's a place for trustees, and I think the main reason for that is because we, at the free sector, simply can't manage the level of clients that need a money advice or debt advice service. And I think the trustee has a perfectly appropriate place when it's appropriate. But more often than not, and certainly the cases that I've seen, and I've got various case studies, one in particular is, I believe is quite typical and quite important, that if you're in a situation where you have £16,000 of debt, and you have a situation where your disposable income is low, if not zero. I've had clients coming in on the verge of signing trust deeds at £100 to £150 per month over a 4-year term, thinking, I better just get this checked out, just to make sure. I've used these guys before, I trust you, can you have a look at that for me? And more often than not, and certainly in the last 3 cases that I looked at, cases that I'm actively dealing with, is now a MAP bankruptcy, a minimum asset process bankruptcy, where the client will be discharged after 6 months with a DCO, a debtor's contribution, set at 0. So it's went from £125 over 4 years to 0 over 6 months, and had given the same protections in place. That, over the last, I would say, half a dozen cases, has been a fairly typical response to effectively mis-selling or misadvice of a trustee. However, there's lots of insolvency practitioners out there that we know and we trust, and the trustee is a viable, sound option for people. That information, that getting that correct advice at that point to balance that is the key, is getting that right at the start.
Given the eye-watering fees that we see sloshing around here, would it not be self-funding if the free sector took this over? Could it not be so?
It depends on what you're talking about here. If we were to be doing protected trust deeds within the free sector, we do not have the regulatory authority to do that in the first place. That's why we would always refer these out. You'd be looking at potentially training up a group of money advisors, if you like, to be this kind of professional conduit that the IPs are currently in this process.
Big leap?
I don't know enough about the qualification route, if you like, of insolvency practitioners, but I believe they have accountancy and law qualifications to do what they do. So make no mistake, it is a highly trained profession.
Andy Whiteman.
So, Lee and Bob, you've talked about protected trust deeds failing, and Anna, you've talked about picking up the pieces there. And Lee, in your answer to your latest question there, you gave an example of somebody who should never have been in a protected trust deed. In general terms, where is the advice coming from to enter into a protected trust deed in these cases where they should never have entered it? Or do you not know that when they come to you? Do you ask them, where did you get this advice from? And have you got any sort of picture of that?
Yeah, I mean, we'll obviously try and endeavour to where the advice come from, but our primary concern is to try and fix the mess that the client are in. So we would concentrate on that as a priority. However, it's important for us as money advisors to know where this dangerous advice is coming from, because it's not just poor, it's dangerous. And Mike mentioned about the lead generation and leading cold calls. And these are the issues that are happening. People are getting called, and as I said previously, about people when they're at their lowest point. And I can give you this magic cure, it's going to make your debt go away, and just sign this document and go. And in some cases, that may well fix the situation. But in the cases that I've mentioned, that's making the situation abundantly worse. So yeah, I mean, if we're there, it's impossible for us to tell where exactly they're coming from or how they managed to get that road if they've phoned them themselves. But they certainly, the lead generation of cold calling is certainly, and the advertising across the media is obviously very prevalent.
Before others come in, can I just follow that one? Because, so these lead generators themselves, of course, don't provide any advice. They're generating a lead for insolvency practitioners.
Yeah.
So the advice that should be being given, whilst they may be persuaded from that cold calling that this is in their best interests, the actual advice they get as to whether to do it will be coming from a professional in many instances. And Carrington Dean, who gave us evidence last week, said of the 40,000 inquiries they take from consumers, 93% of the people they speak to are advised that a trust deed is not in their best interests. And they told us that people are talked through all the options. Are you basically saying that whilst that may be the case on paper, it evidently is not happening in practice?
Well,
otherwise they would not be entering these protected trust deeds.
Well, I'm certainly not going to question, because I don't have any facts on an individual insolvency practitioner's practices. What I can say is within the people, the clients I see in my surgery, they tell me that they've been contacted by these lead generators. They've been given lots of false hopes and lots of either untruths or clearly some even lies regarding to the figures involved, the debt involved, your homeowner, don't worry about that, that'll be okay. I'd like to think when it goes to somewhere like an established insolvency practitioner, maybe that's the reason why the 93% are rejected, because the lead generation are not doing the job properly to get the right people into that category. So they're sending so many of them or anybody down because they're getting that money for that. Maybe that's the primary concern. Maybe that's because we'll pass you on whether it's right or not because we're going to get £1,000 for it. So yes, but without knowing the facts of that, that's going to be difficult for me to question. I can only comment on the clients and what they've told me directly, and they've told me directly that they've been told and they've been promised these things will be happening, and they're not happening.
I think wanted to come in, and then Anna Hamilton.
Just to come in on the lead generation and then the follow-up advice on an insolvency practitioner. Quite often the impression of what this protected trust deed is going to do is set at the outset. And I think that's the problem. That's why these guys are not adding any value to the process. Now, last week you heard from Michelle Thorpe, who said that their RPB is now recommending that they use FCA authorised companies. Bear in mind that prior to that, and there's people in trust deeds now, have been advised by one person with a phone. Anybody could have set up as a lead generator prior to the IPA going down this regulatory route and given advice. We don't know what's been said, to consumers. Another example that I came across was somebody who was in a guarantor loan and was told by the lead generator that the guarantor loan would be dealt with by the protected trust deed. And of course it wasn't. So the protected trust deed went through, the guarantor was called on to cover the payments. The guarantor was a friend of the borrower, so that obviously caused a lot of difficulty in their friendship. And they came to seek advice together to see what they could do. We took that complaint as far as we could on behalf of the client, and we actually received a recording of the phone call that followed up. And in the recording, you can hear the IP actually telling the lady that the guarantor loan wasn't going to get sorted out. But this was a follow-up phone call to the advice she had already been given, and you can hear in the background there's a child crying, and she is trying to sort out domestic duties at some point of the day, and she is not taking anything in. The impression had already been set that this guarantor loan was going to be dealt with. Can I also come back to another thing? You did mention Carrington Dean there. Carrington Dean are unique in that they are both FCA regulated and regulated by an RPB. not all insolvency practitioners are FCA regulated. So I think we need to define what we mean by advice. Because if they're not FCA regulated, they're not able to give advice on other debt options. So I think, you know, Carrington Dean aside, they're clearly the biggest provider of trust deeds in Scotland, but there are other firms where there is not a full breadth of advice that can be given because they're not regulated to do so. So I think one of the questions we need to ask is, what do you mean when you say, you know, people get advice before they enter into protected trust deed about their options? Is it about their insolvency options because that's all they're allowed to give advice on, or is it about all the options that are available to them? And this issue of regulation is actually quite important. The Citizens Advice Bureau network is FCA regulated. We have to give advice on all options, and we have to say why other options aren't appropriate. And we have to back that up and be prepared to back that up if the FCA investigate us. And the client also has complaint rights to go to the Financial Ombudsman Service if we get it wrong. That's not the case if you're not FCA regulated. And where do you go with your complaint?
That's an important point. Anna Hamilton, were you wanting to?
Yeah, I mean, just on the point of where the advice came from, I'm going to reiterate some of the stuff that's been said in the previous evidence hearings. The advertising, so the way people are picking these trust deeds up, things like on Facebook pushed advertising, and it's all very. There's something quite cloaked about it. So, for example, one of the client cases that I looked at for before coming to this today was pushed at mums out of debt, and the entire website is geared towards your children will get much more from you, you'll be a better parent, you'll be this, you know, really is geared towards the emotional bargaining with this that before the person's ever signed up with a trust deed. Now, the way these websites are set up, there's also a dad's out of debt. One of our clients approached the process through the big debt payoff, a competition to pay off all your debts, which was pretty unrealistic and all, you know. But fortunately, these people are sometimes coming to us before they've signed up, but they're being targeted because of their protected characteristics, quite frankly. They're not being targeted because they're in debt specifically. It's about being a mum in debt or a dad in debt. It's, you know, there's some really, really strange things happening that allow people to be, to be targeted through advertising in that fashion. It's not, do you need a trust deed? Do you need support with dealing with your debts? And then looking at all the options. I'm totally with Mike. If you want to give advice on debts in Scotland, you should be given advice on all the solutions that are open to a debtor. That should not simply be even just the options that are available through legislation. There should be other options. There are not other approaches that we can take with clients that don't take them down the legislative route. And all of those options should be open. I understand that insolvency practitioners are not then going to provide that option, but they should at least be able to discuss it and to direct somebody to the appropriate place to seek support with that. So there is definitely some evidence that shows that the advertising is directly relating to misappropriate access to trust deeds through some of the work that I've looked at.
Okay, we've also heard evidence that if a trust deed fails, if someone doesn't complete it and they don't get a discharge, this tends to be the result of non-cooperation. So that was a clear message last week that those are the reasons. What's your comment?
I'll happily take that. What we see is somebody who's going through a process which is quite stressful. They've agreed to pay off their debts over a period of 4 years. They're protecting something usually. That's the purpose of, you know, going into a trust deed. It might be their career. There may be a professional body that they can't become bankrupt, but bankruptcy would be their other solution. It might be that they're protecting an asset, their home. So there are a number of reasons that people might go into a trust deed that don't have the access to bankruptcy, for example, which would be a similar product in terms of duration and the contribution. But when people go into these things and something happens, they're dealing with something that's happened that's so major they cannot meet their contribution anymore, and they're expected at that point in time to jump through hoops for a trustee. Now, I do believe that a number of debtors will back off from the process at that point in time, which they would probably benefit from engaging more with the process, but all of the cards are in the trustee's hands. The debtor has nothing but answers. They can only give answers. They're on the back foot throughout this thing. I mean, one of the things that I would like to see is an automatic discharge. If the trustee can't prove through some audited process, if they can't prove that the debtor has not cooperated, then an automatic discharge, in the way that an automatic discharge works with bankruptcy. But there is a sort of an onus of evidence on the debtor here to prove that their situation is changed to a degree that they cannot continue on the process. And often they were strapped in the first place. You know, they're given every single penny of disposable income is going into a trust deed in the first instance. So a slight change of circumstances can knock that quite dramatically for them. We have a number of times when we see clients, it's often too far down the line. They can't apply to the sheriff for an appeal, and they can't go through the insolvency process. When we do try to support people to make a complaint, we tend to tell them how to do it. That's been the approach that we have taken. We have more recently started to support people with the complaints process, because we feel that there's clearly not a lot of complaints going in. We see more people than we see complaints being registered. So we are now supporting people with the complaints process to see if we can't engage more people through that. But it's difficult when they're feeling a bit beat up.
Mike?
The lack of cooperation issue, we experience this as well, you know, with our own clients too. In some cases, people do not get in touch with us, you know, after a while, and don't re-engage, stop making their arrangements. So we accept that there's a significant amount of people that will be in that situation. But if you look back through the failure rates that are in the annual reports for the accountant and bankruptcy, I'm going to take you back to 2015-16. One firm had a failure rate of 88%, another 87%. The following year, the same two firms had 63% and 74%. That's a lot of people not cooperating, and maybe suggest that there was actually something else wrong there with either the sales process at the outset or just a blanket approach to people who were struggling, which was just shut down the thing. Now, from the evidence you got last week from the RPBs, again, they don't understand why people are failing to complete the protected trust deed. And I think this is where we need to go. I think David Hilferty suggested last week as well that, you know, this should be happening, that there should be an understanding of why people aren't completing these. I think there's a better approach now, but it's almost, you know, the stable door being closed after the horse has bolted, because we have gone through a significant number of years. And I would just say as well that these failure rates were highlighted to the accountant and bankruptcy as a problem, and nothing has been done up until now. So, you know, coming to it now, we still don't know anything. We knew this was a problem in 2015-16, and we still don't understand what the problem is.
And just one final question, Convener. The Money Advice Service published a report July 2018 looking at supply and demand of debt advice across the UK, and the unmet demand in Scotland as a percentage of the supply was 88%, the highest of any region of the UK. I mean, West Midlands was 42%, North East of England 32%, Yorkshire and Humber 55%, 88%. Why? What's going on in Scotland that we have such? Is that due to more indebtedness, or is it due to undersupply of debt advice? Probably both.
Who would like to take this for the team? We're slightly conscious of time now. Perhaps Mike Holmyard, and then we'll come to questions from the Deputy Convener.
I'll take it for the team then. A lot of the debt advice is funded by local authorities in Scotland. So when local authorities are strapped for cash. Debt advice itself is not a statutory function, so it's an area that you can cut back on. And that's the issue. We've seen something like 40% reduction in...
To budgets in England as well. So why?
Yes, yeah. It's just down to choices, you know, and there's not as much a local authority debt advice presence in England and Wales. A lot of the funding for debt advice is a lot more directly and funded by the Money and Pension Service, or the Money Advice Service, as they were before. Whereas, you know, the situation that we have now, we've got this levy funding that's come to Scotland, £4 million. That's only part of the picture. Local authorities are another part, and the vast majority comes through them. So when the local authorities cut back in Scotland on debt advice funding, I think it's having a more significant impact than elsewhere.
Thanks.
Thanks very much, Convener. I wonder if I could just stick briefly with the failure issue that Andy Whiteman raised there. I mean, who decides that a PTD has failed? It sounds like an obvious question, but is it a person failing to pay once or twice or three times, or is it failing to engage? What constitutes failure, and who decides that it's failed?
There's various things, and usually my understanding of it, and because it can be different in every case, but generally what will happen is that the trustee will be looking for something from the debtor, and the debtor won't be able to provide that, or will provide information that doesn't satisfy the trustee, and the relationship tends to break down, and then the debtor will stop engaging, and at that point the trustee may move to be discharged if they can't see any further remuneration for themselves, as it would appear to be the picture. So when you can't see that you're going to have further ingathering of funds, there's not going to be a completion at the full level of the trustee. Now, instead of at that stage understanding what has caused, going back to the first issue and saying, right, okay, what is the problem here? Why can't we have some conclusion? It just seems to be easier to discharge.
The trustee determines.
The trustee makes the determination about whether
they want to discharge. Can the person appeal that to somebody to whom?
They can. They have, I think it's 21 days to appeal to a sheriff. But
did you say they can't appeal that?
They can. They can appeal. They can appeal the trustee not discharging them from the trustee and failing the trustee instead. That can be appealed to the sheriff, and there's also an opportunity to make a complaint to the insolvency practitioners.
See, we heard last week, I think Andy mentioned it there as well, that I'm sure we heard last week that you can be discharged from a PTD by cooperating, even if that meant ultimately you don't pay anything. Is that true?
You can be discharged from a personal trust. You can be, from a protected trustee if you have satisfied all the conditions that you entered into. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to have paid all of the contributions. You just have to have, in good faith, done all you can to complete on the promise you made at the outset of the trustee.
But who determines that?
The trustee.
Mike?
I've never seen a case where somebody has made no payments to a protected trustee and then has been discharged from their debts. So I think that's highly unlikely, I'm afraid.
I wouldn't say that we've seen a case where they've made no contribution, but we have seen cases where the trustee has elected to discharge a debtor from the trustee when the situation has changed to the degree that the debtor will not be able to honour the obligations of it, and they have been discharged from their debts. We have seen many more cases, however, that hasn't been the case, even when we've tried to argue that for the debtor, that it just doesn't really wash.
And can the PTD, if it fails, be restarted if a person, says I can now afford to pay that because the circumstances have changed? Can we kickstart it and restart it again, or once it's failed, is it gone?
It's gone. Once the trustee has discharged themselves from the process, that's it finished. The equivalent situation in a bankruptcy is that the person wouldn't actually get discharged if they failed to cooperate. So basically, in a bankruptcy, you're stuck in it until you contact the trustee and start dealing with them. Again, the ultimate aim of every bankruptcy is everybody gets discharged from their debts. The thing with the protected trust deed is when it fails, you get your debts back. So from an advice point of view, from our members, if people are in situations where they can't guarantee what their income is going to be the next 4 years, they don't know what's going to happen to them, it's almost safer to recommend that somebody looks at something like a bankruptcy where there's a definite outcome. You're going to get discharged from your debt if you cooperate, make your payments, and if your circumstances change, the sequestration can actually cope with that and allow you to make lower payments. This is not what we're getting with the protected trust deed market. When a failure happens because somebody's not made their payments or the circumstances have changed, it's difficult to get the flexibility that you need to allow you to either extend the trust deed or to end the trust deed at that point in time.
And would you support that kind of flexibility being brought into the PTD system?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Richard Lyle.
Yeah, we have a financial system that does not support debtors. I actually know that your debt advice is an art, just to do it. And basically the situation is that we have people who cannot pay because they enter into agreement saying, I'm going to pay £50 a month. But that £50 a month goes because the kids need shoes, or they need to buy this, they need to buy that. So really, the debtor is the person who is continually getting put on. And, let's be honest, I've got to be honest here. There's a problem with trust deeds. Thousands and thousands of pounds in fees are being made by trust deed suppliers, and I make no apology in saying that. And they can walk away, the debtor can't walk away, and the creditor gets nada, nothing. So why are we doing it? We really need to change this. And sorry, I have to come back at you.
Your question?
Yes, my question is going
a question to the witnesses, or were you answering your own question?
No, my question is we need to change this. And basically, what I'm suggesting is, you said earlier, well, we need more debt advisors. I agree with you. Used to be a councillor, and a local authority councillor, by the way. So why can't you go into trustees, and why can't you charge these fees? That or a decent fee, a reasonable fee that people can live with, and give them the advice and say, no, that's not for you. Lee, I think you've got that experience, so tell me.
Yeah, I mean, I think I suppose the challenge there would be that we would then have potential. We're not giving free and impartial advice. Because if we were, as a local authority, going to gain from my advice for the person to go into a trust deed that we were going to sign them up to, and if that was the right decision, then fine. I wouldn't have no issues with that whatsoever. But I suppose where it comes back to me, where I enjoy working in the free sector, make sure the client is at the heart of what we do, and giving the advice to the client when they need that advice to what's best options for them, whether it's a bankruptcy, whether that's a trust deed, whether that's an informal payment plan on a short term because they've got a significant change coming in 3 to 6 months, which is a common problem with a trustee, when they're not looking ahead at 3 to 6 months. The kids are leaving school, the benefits are going to change. We're aware of that. So let's put something else in place and then come back with a statutory protection later when that stabilisation is there. We are there for the long term, for what's best for the client, rather than the short term to what's best for the insolvency practitioner.
Money advice.
Or whoever's selling
money advice. In my North Lanarkshire Council, it's money advice sentence. There are a couple of council officials who do money advice also. But do you contact companies and make arrangements on payments with companies on behalf of clients who walk in your door?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's, I would say, the bread and butter of what we do. Yeah. Somebody comes into a door, the first thing we'll do is gather the information, and then we'll go from there.
So in your experience, vast experience, and I've got a vast experience sitting in front of me, in your experience, in all your experiences, how many of those arrangements fail compared to trust deeds?
So should I say again?
How many of your arrangements fail with companies compared to trust deeds failures? Failures of 88% for trust deeds. How many failures do you have in setting up a regular payment? Now, that regular payment, and I'm sure you could tell me, as I know, could be varied from week to week, month to month, because you could phone up the company and say, Jeannie McShugall's come in to tell me that she can't pay £20 this week, but she can pay 10. Will you take it? Yes, we will. Because most companies want their money. You know, they want their payment back. So, you know, I'm sure you do that. So how many of your arrangements fail compared to trust deeds?
Failure rate would, I've got no statistics on it, but it would certainly be lower than 88%, but I couldn't give you a figure. But it'd be substantially lower, I would say.
Mike?
I think the more important issue is when there's a failure, what are the consequences? So with a trust deed, you get all your debt back with other debt options. If you're in a bankruptcy, your payment can be changed and it doesn't affect your discharge. If you're in a debt arrangement scheme, your payment can be varied. And if it so happens that you can no longer sustain the debt arrangement scheme, at least every month, 78% of your payment has been made to your creditors. So when your debt arrangement scheme fails, you're in the position of still being further forward with your debt than you were at the start.
Yeah, but the arrangements you're sending in, you're making payments of the person. They may be from a company, they may get a payment book, or they may do a standing order, and that whole payment goes to that creditor. So the creditor's getting £10. The arrangement's made at £10, the creditor's getting £10. With the trust deed, the creditor's not even getting the £10. For 18 months, they're getting nothing. So really, you know, how are we defending? Why should we defend trust deeds? I know we need something, you know, but my view has always been that people need debt advice, people need debt relief. And if we write off their debt, I have to say that then that's recorded, and then they can't get debt again, because if they know that they can get their debts written off, everybody will run out and buy something, then they'll pay it, and then get it written off. We certainly can't advocate that. But basically, I made in the question I want to ask you, I've suggested that the accountancy and bankruptcy should become more involved in this and set up a system that's better for debtors and creditors, because this whole system, to my mind, since I've come on this committee, is not working. Has to be reviewed. In fact, last week I smiled when one of the witnesses suggested it was the Parliament's fault. So if it's the Parliament's fault, we're going to fix it. How would you fix it, to finish my question?
I think, as has been said before, and I would agree with David Menzies here, that we need a review of all the statutory debt solutions, debt arrangement scheme, bankruptcy and protected trust deeds, to work out what they're for. And you've seen and you've had evidence given to you that, you know, one tweak changes everything. Richard Dennis the first week talked about that change to the length of time of a bankruptcy, how that aligned a protected trust deed and a bankruptcy, and suddenly the protected trust deed market took off again. So, you know, if we make these little tweaks all around the edges, they always have a knock-on effect somewhere else, or somebody sees an opportunity, as in the case of protected trust deeds. And, you know, as the last 4 years have shown, you know, since the alignment of the period of payment, you know, people will always step in when they see a gap and an opportunity. So rather than making more opportunities or more gaps, let's look at everything in the round and say, what is a protected trust deed for? Is it still suitable? I mean, David Menzies last week said it wasn't suitable for what it's currently being used for. I would agree with him on that. Let's look at that. Let's look at what a bankruptcy should achieve. Should it be about funding the accountant in bankruptcy? Should people have to make contributions? Should people get debt relief when they enter into a bankruptcy? You know, these are all fundamental questions. Should the DAS scheme allow people to leave the DAS scheme once they've paid a certain amount of pennies in the pound. So, you know, currently there's a limit set on that if they've paid their debt for 12 years and they've paid 70% of it off, then they can potentially be let off their DAS with permission of their creditors. But that's far too long. You know, there's a number of issues here that we could look at and change, but we need to look at everything and not just keep changing little bits on one solution.
To finish off, should people, if you allow me, convener, should people, if someone owes a company £1,000, should they be able to negotiate a part payment?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, they can, can't they?
They can, yeah.
So they already can do that.
They can negotiate a full and final settlement of a particular debt if they come into a bit of money.
But I think Lee Kilgallen, I was wanting to give the opportunity to come in and comment on how he thinks the system should be changed for the better.
Well, I think I wouldn't disagree with anything Mike said. I think the situation is that we have tweaked and changed and tweaked and changed the statutory options for as long as I've been a debt advisor, and any insolvency practitioner, any money advisor, debt advisor, counsellor would tell you that what we're doing just now, and particularly in some of these areas that we've talked about, the failures and the ones that are not working, is not good enough because people are not getting the service and not getting the product they want to go into. Is it fair to keep someone on the hook? And David Hilfrich last week talked about keeping people in the tight rein for 4, 5, 6 years. If 4, 5, 6 years is a long time not to have any disposable income, not to have any option of taking the family on holiday, not to have any option to buying the kids the extra wee bits that you want to do. That's a long time. The mental health aspect of that is something that I see on a daily basis. It's vitally important that we recognise that. We have to look at that as a government, and hopefully we can come out with someone that's going to give people the debt relief quicker when there's no sustainable reason why they should be in that plan for longer. And that's what I would like to happen.
All right, well, I think that's our time, so we'll finish there. Thank you very much to all of you for coming in today. I'll suspend the meeting. We'll move into private session now.